The sun was already sinking when Saladin realized something had gone terribly wrong. Across the dusty plain near Montgisard, his banners still fluttered. His army, tens of thousands strong, still stood in formation. By every rule of medieval warfare, this should have been a massacre in his favor. And yet, somewhere in the chaos, his elite cavalry was breaking. His commanders were shouting orders no one could hear. Men were running. Not retreating, running. And charging straight toward them were fewer than 500 knights. Not an army, not a kingdom. A desperate remnant led by a teenage king so sick he could barely feel his own hands. What followed would shock the medieval world, fracture an empire's momentum, and echo through history as one of the most improbable military victories ever recorded. By the year 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not supposed to exist anymore. From the outside, it still looked formidable. Stone walls catching the sun, banners snapping in the Mediterranean wind, churches rising over ancient streets. But beneath the surface, it was rotting from exhaustion. Decades of war had drained its manpower. Its alliances were fragile. Its enemies were learning faster than it could adapt. And worst of all, its king was dying. Jerusalem was a Crusader state, carved out of conquest and sustained by belief. It had been born in blood less than a century earlier, forged by armies that crossed continents, chasing salvation. But faith alone could not garrison walls, feed soldiers, or replace men lost year after year in desert wars. Every knight who fell was harder to replace than the last. To the north, Tripoli wavered. To the east, Antioch stood isolated. And to the south, there was Saladin. For years, the Muslim world had been divided by rival dynasties, fractured loyalties, and political intrigue. The Crusader states survived largely because their enemies could not unite. That era was ending. Saladin was not just another warlord. He was methodical, patient, strategic. He understood logistics, morale, and timing in ways few commanders of his age did. While the Franks argued among themselves, he consolidated Egypt, then Syria, then city by city, oath by oath. He stitched together something terrifying. A unified front. Jerusalem stood directly in its path. Inside the city, power was an uncomfortable triangle. Noble families maneuvered for influence. Military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, answered to their own rules. Regents whispered behind tapestries, already thinking about succession. Everyone knew the truth they avoided saying aloud. King Baldwin IV would not live long enough to see old age. Leprosy had announced itself when he was still a child. At first, it was subtle. Numbness in the fingers, wounds that didn't hurt. But leprosy was merciless. It consumed flesh slowly, stripping sensation first, then strength, then dignity. By his teenage years, Baldwin ruled a kingdom he could no longer fully feel. Yet he rode. He commanded. He refused to disappear. That refusal would change history. The strategic situation in 1177 was grim. Saladin had tested the kingdom's defenses before. Raids, probing attacks, cavalry skirmishes. Each time, he learned more. Each time, Jerusalem bled resources it could not replace. Baldwin's advisors urged caution. Avoid open battle. Preserve forces. Wait for reinforcements from Europe that might never come. Saladin, meanwhile, sensed weakness. That autumn, he gathered an army unlike any he had led before. Veterans from Egypt, Syrian cavalry hardened by years of war, infantry, archers, engineers. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. His target was not a border fortress. It was the heart of the Crusader realm, Jerusalem itself. As Saladin crossed into the kingdom, towns fell silent. Fields were abandoned. Smoke rose where villages had been burned to deny him supplies. But even scorched earth could only slow an army of that size. Baldwin faced a terrible choice. Jerusalem's main field army was scattered. Many knights were away. Others guarded distant castles. To concentrate forces would mean leaving cities exposed. To stay behind walls would mean watching the countryside fall, and inviting a siege he could not survive. And Baldwin knew something else. Saladin did not expect resistance. The Muslim commander believed the king too weak, the army too small, the situation too hopeless for an open confrontation. He allowed his forces to spread out. Confident victory was inevitable. Confidence, after all, is a luxury earned by success, but confidence is also a crack. From his litter, Baldwin listened to reports, enemy movements, distances, numbers. He could not grip a sword for long. He could barely mount a horse without help. But his mind was sharp, and his resolve was iron. He would not wait to be crushed. Against nearly every piece of conventional wisdom, Baldwin ordered a concentration of forces near Ascalon. It was a gamble bordering on madness. Fewer than 500 knights answered the call, supported by infantry and the military orders. It was not enough to fight a pitched battle. It was barely enough to form a line. Yet Baldwin believed timing mattered more than numbers. If Saladin could be caught unprepared, if his army could be struck while divided, foraging, relaxed, then shock might do what strength could not. It was a strategy born not from confidence, but necessity. The army gathered quietly. No grand speeches, no triumphal banners. Men prayed. Knights checked straps and blades. Templars tightened their formation. Hospitallers adjusted armor scarred from earlier wars. They knew the odds. Across the plain, Saladin's forces moved freely, unaware that a king they believed half dead was preparing to ride directly into their path. The land around Montgisard was unremarkable. Rolling terrain, scrub, open ground. No dramatic cliffs, no natural fortress. Just space, and space, Baldwin knew, could become a weapon. As the Crusader force moved out, carrying with them a relic said to contain a fragment of the true cross, something subtle began to shift, not on the battlefield, but in the men themselves. Desperation has a way of clarifying purpose. There would be no retreat, no second chance. Only one charge, only one moment where everything would either collapse or defy history. And Saladin, brilliant as he was, did not yet see it coming. Long before the name Montgisard would be whispered with disbelief, long before 500 knights would scar his legend, Saladin had already become something rare in the medieval world, a unifier. To understand why his defeat would shock so deeply, you have to understand what he had already achieved. Because Saladin was not merely winning battles. He was reshaping an entire civilization's sense of destiny. He was born Yusuf ibn Ayyub in 1137 in the city of Tikrit on the banks of the Tigris. There was nothing prophetic about his birth. His family was Kurdish, respected but not royal, loyal soldiers rather than kings. Power did not fall into his hands. It climbed there, rung by rung, through discipline, patience, and a talent for seeing the long game, when others chased short victories. The Islamic world of Saladin's youth was fractured. Egypt was ruled by the decaying Fatimid Caliphate, Shia in faith and hollow in strength. Syria was a mosaic of rival emirs, more concerned with undermining each other than confronting the Crusader states carved into their lands. The Franks survived not because they were invincible, but because their enemies were divided. Saladin learned early that swords alone would never fix that. His rise began in the shadow of another man, his uncle, Shirkuh, a ruthless general serving Nur ad-Din, the Sunni ruler of Syria. Shirkuh was everything Saladin was not: aggressive, brutal, impatient. When the two were sent to Egypt on campaign, it was Shirkuh who commanded, and Saladin who observed. He watched how victories were wasted, how fear bred rebellion, how cities conquered by force alone never truly stayed conquered. When Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169, something unexpected happened. The young, relatively unassuming Saladin was appointed vizier of Egypt. It should have been a death sentence. He was a Sunni ruling a Shia court. A foreigner surrounded by enemies. A general without an army entirely his own. Many assumed he would be assassinated within months. Saladin understood the danger, and instead of reacting with terror, he moved with calculation. He reformed Egypt quietly. He paid soldiers on time. He respected religious institutions. He dismantled the Fatimid Caliphate, not with slaughter, but with inevitability. When the last Fatimid caliph died, Saladin simply did not replace him. Egypt slipped into the Sunni world almost without noticing. Power, he understood, was strongest when it felt natural. From Egypt's wealth, Saladin built something the Crusader states could not match: sustainability. Grain, gold, horses, men. Logistics became his silent weapon. While Frankish knights relied on reinforcements from across the sea, Saladin trained year after year, campaign after campaign, refining an army that could move fast, strike hard, and endure. But even then, he did not rush Jerusalem. First, he needed legitimacy. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the Muslim world faced another fracture. Instead, Saladin stepped forward, not as a conqueror, but as a protector of Sunni Islam. City after city opened its gates to him. Some resisted. Those that did learned that Saladin could be merciless when necessary, but restraint was his preference. By the mid-1170s, he ruled Egypt and Syria in all but name. The dream of jihad against the Crusader states, dormant for decades, began to feel real again. Poets wrote of it, preachers called for it, soldiers believed in it, and belief, Saladin knew, multiplies strength. The Franks sensed the shift. Raids intensified. Border fortresses were tested. Saladin responded methodically, probing their weaknesses. He watched how they assembled armies, how long it took, where they argued. He noticed something crucial. The Crusader states relied heavily on charismatic leaders. Kill the leader, the army faltered. Divide the nobility, the response slowed. Pressure the countryside, and panic spread faster than any messenger. Jerusalem's greatest weakness, however, sat on its throne. Baldwin IV was young, sick, childless. To Saladin, this looked like providence. A kingdom ruled by a dying boy could not withstand sustained pressure. Time itself was on Saladin's side. By 1177, he believed the moment had come. His army crossed into the kingdom of Jerusalem, not cautiously, but confidently. This was no lightning raid. This was a demonstration of dominance. He allowed his forces to spread wide, foraging freely, devastating the land. It was psychological warfare as much as military strategy. Show the people that resistance was futile, that the kingdom could not protect them. He expected Baldwin to hide behind walls. He expected negotiations, delay, fear. What he did not expect was a counterstroke. The truth was that Saladin had begun to believe his own momentum. Every campaign had gone his way. Every risk had paid off. The narrative forming around him, that he was chosen, unstoppable, had begun to seep into his command structure. Officers assumed victory before battle. Scouts grew careless. Discipline loosened. It is a dangerous thing when success becomes habit. As Saladin's army moved toward Ascalon, reports filtered in of Frankish movement, but they seemed insignificant. A few hundred knights? A symbolic gesture, perhaps. A desperate attempt to save face. Nothing worthy of altering plans. Saladin pressed on. Behind him, his army stretched long and thin. Cavalry units operated independently. Infantry lagged. Supply trains sprawled across miles. It was efficient for devastation, but vulnerable to shock. And shock was exactly what Baldwin intended. What makes Montgisard so astonishing is not simply the numbers involved. It is that Saladin, of all commanders, should have been caught in this position. He was careful by nature, calculated, rarely reckless, but even great commanders are human. That afternoon, as the Crusader army closed the distance, Saladin was not armored for battle. Some accounts say he was resting. Others suggest he was overseeing logistics, confident no serious threat existed. His guard was light, his men dispersed. By the time the alarm spread, it was already too late to reform properly. The enemy was not supposed to be there. And suddenly, the story Saladin had been writing, the inevitable fall of Jerusalem, the fulfillment of jihad, hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough for history to slip in another direction. Because charging toward him now was not a frightened kingdom hiding behind walls. It was a dying king riding straight into legend. And the miracle of Montgisard was about to be born, not from destiny, not from prophecy, but from a single miscalculation by the most formidable leader of the age. The first sign came during a game. Baldwin was still a child, playing with other noble boys in Jerusalem's courtyards, when his tutor noticed something strange. The boys were testing each other's endurance, pinching, scratching, roughhousing in the way children always have. When Baldwin's arm was burned with a candle flame, he didn't cry out, he didn't even flinch. It wasn't bravery, it was numbness. In the medieval world, leprosy was not just a disease. It was a sentence, social, spiritual, and political. It meant slow decay, isolation, and, eventually, disappearance. When the physicians confirmed the diagnosis, they already knew what it meant for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Their king would never grow old. Baldwin IV ascended the throne at 13, crowned not for his strength, but for the absence of better options. The kingdom's nobility accepted him because there was no one else, and because they believed time would remove him before difficult decisions had to be made. They were wrong. Leprosy attacked Baldwin's body relentlessly. His nerves died first, robbing him of pain, then control. Fingers stiffened, wounds festered unnoticed. Riding a horse became agony, masked by pride. By his late teens, his face bore the marks of the disease, and rumors spread among enemies and allies alike. Yet something curious happened as Baldwin's body weakened. His will hardened. He learned to rule through endurance. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered every slight, every oath. When he could no longer wield a sword effectively, he wielded presence. When he could no longer ride for long, he made each appearance count. To the Franks, he became a symbol of sacrifice, a king who suffered visibly for the survival of the kingdom. To the Muslim world, he was dismissed as a temporary obstacle, a boy propped up by regents and military orders. Saladin never met Baldwin before Montgisard, but he understood the optics. A sick teenager ruling a fractured state? History favoured the patient. What Saladin did not understand was how little Baldwin valued his own survival. Leprosy stripped away illusion. Baldwin knew every year might be his last. There was no future to preserve for himself, only a kingdom to protect for as long as he could. That knowledge made him dangerous. While nobles debated alliances and succession, Baldwin studied warfare. He absorbed lessons from veterans, from Templars, from Hospitallers hardened by years of border conflict. He learned terrain, timing, morale. He understood that Jerusalem could never win wars of attrition. It could only win moments. That philosophy shaped every decision he made. By 1177, Baldwin could barely feel his hands. Mounting a horse required assistance. His face was partially veiled to hide the worst signs of disease. Yet, when reports arrived that Saladin had crossed the border with a massive force, Baldwin did not retreat into fatalism. He saw opportunity. Most commanders in his position would have done the rational thing. Withdraw behind Jerusalem's walls. Send pleas to Europe. Preserve the army. Baldwin did not have the luxury of decades. A siege might starve the city. A slow collapse would kill the kingdom long before reinforcements arrived. So Baldwin made a decision that shocked his court. He would ride out, not with a grand army, he didn't have one, but with whatever force could be assembled quickly. Speed mattered more than numbers, surprise mattered more than strength. The nobility objected. The odds were absurd. Saladin's army outnumbered theirs many times over. Baldwin's illness alone made the plan seem suicidal. Advisors urged caution, delay, negotiation. Baldwin listened, then he refused. There is a moment in leadership where calculation ends and conviction begins. For Baldwin, that moment came with clarity born of mortality. If Jerusalem was to fall, it would not fall without resistance. If he was to die, it would be facing the enemy, not waiting behind walls. The army he gathered was a fragment of a kingdom. Knights from noble houses, Templars bound by oath, Hospitallers hardened by service, infantry who knew they would be trampled if the charge failed. Before the march, Baldwin ordered the true cross brought from Jerusalem. Whether one believes in its divine power or not, its psychological impact was undeniable. Men knelt. Prayers spread through the ranks. Fear did not vanish, but it transformed into resolve. If they were to die, they would die believing their sacrifice mattered. For Baldwin, the relic was more than a symbol. It was a reminder of suffering endured for a cause greater than oneself. In that sense, it mirrored his own life. As the army moved, Baldwin rode at its center, supported by attendants. He could not lead from the front in the traditional sense, but his presence anchored the men. The sight of their dying king refusing to stay behind gave them something Saladin's army lacked that day. Desperation sharpened into unity. Saladin, meanwhile, continued his advance unconcerned. Reports of Baldwin's movement reached him, but carried little urgency. A few hundred knights could not threaten his campaign. If anything, he saw it as proof of weakness, a symbolic gesture from a collapsing regime. That misjudgment would prove catastrophic, because Baldwin was not trying to win a war. He was trying to create a single, irreversible moment. A moment so violent, so sudden, that numbers would stop mattering. As the Crusader force approached Montgisard, the king's condition worsened. The march was brutal. Pain was constant. But Baldwin never turned back. Those who rode near him later recalled his silence, not from fear, but focus. He understood what was coming, and he accepted it. Across the plain, Saladin's army lay spread out, relaxed, unformed. The distance between certainty and disaster was shrinking with every step. And the boy king, numb in body, ruthless in clarity, was about to gamble everything he had left on a single charge. The land around Montgisard did not announce itself as a killing ground. There were no towering ridges, no narrow passes, no obvious choke points carved by nature. It was open country, rolling earth broken by low rises, patches of scrub, and shallow wadis that cut the terrain just enough to disrupt formation. To an army on the move, it looked harmless. To an army unprepared, it was treacherous. Saladin's forces were scattered across it. This was not carelessness in the usual sense. It was confidence, shaped by success. His army had crossed Frankish territory almost unopposed. Villages had emptied at his approach. No significant force had dared to challenge him in the open. The assumption had settled in. The Franks would not risk battle. So Saladin did what victorious commanders often do. He allowed the army to breathe. Units foraged independently. Cavalry detachments spread wide to gather supplies and intimidate the countryside. Infantry lagged behind, stretched along the roads. Supply trains moved at their own pace. The army remained formidable, but cohesion, the invisible glue that holds formations together, had loosened. Montgisard lay near the road between Ramla and Ascalon, not far from the coast. It was a crossroads of sorts, but not one that demanded caution. Saladin had no reason to believe he was walking into a trap. Meanwhile, Baldwin's army moved with unnatural urgency. Speed was everything. The Crusaders could not afford delay, scouting errors, or debate. They marched hard, riding exhaustion like a weapon. Dust-coated armor. Horses labored. Men drank sparingly. There was no room for hesitation. As they approached the battlefield, Baldwin made a final, critical decision. He would not wait for reinforcements that would never arrive. He would not attempt complex maneuvers. He would strike immediately. The timing was surgical. Saladin's army was mid-movement, neither fully encamped nor fully formed for battle. Many soldiers were unarmored, horses were unsaddled, commanders were separated from their men. The army's sheer size worked against it now, slowing communication and response. This was the window Baldwin had been waiting for. Accounts differ on the exact moment of discovery. Some suggest Saladin's scouts spotted the Crusaders too late. Others claim locals raised the alarm. What matters is this. When word reached Saladin that a Frankish force was approaching at speed, it did not trigger panic. It triggered disbelief. A few hundred knights charging an army many times their size seemed irrational, almost insulting. Saladin initially assumed it was a feint, or a desperate skirmish meant to cover a retreat. He did not immediately recall his dispersed units. That delay, minutes perhaps, would prove decisive. By the time the Crusaders crested the rise near Montgisard, they could see it all. Muslim cavalry scattered across the plain, infantry clustered without order, banners distant from one another, an army caught between confidence and chaos. For the men riding with Baldwin, the sight was both terrifying and electrifying. There would be no second chance. The true cross was raised. Whether through faith, adrenaline, or sheer survival instinct, something shifted. The line tightened. Knights lowered lances. Infantry braced behind them. There were no elaborate formations, only a brutal, focused wedge aimed straight at the heart of the enemy. Saladin's command struggled to react. Orders were shouted. Messengers rode hard, but coordination across a stretched army takes time, and time was gone. The Crusader charge began not with a roar, but with momentum. Hooves thundered, armor rattled. The ground trembled as 500 knights accelerated toward the center of Saladin's force. This was not a probing attack. It was a do-or-die collision. Psychology did the rest. Soldiers accustomed to facing static defenses or cautious advances suddenly saw an enemy charging directly at them. Fast, unified, unafraid. Shock rippled outward. Units closest to the impact point wavered. Some tried to form ranks too late. Others broke instinctively, fleeing the oncoming mass. The charge smashed into Saladin's army like a hammer into glass. Where it struck, cohesion collapsed. Horses screamed. Men fell. Banners disappeared beneath the chaos. The Crusaders did not stop. They drove through, splitting the army's center before resistance could solidify. This was the nightmare scenario for any commander. An army does not need to be destroyed to be defeated. It only needs to believe it is. Saladin attempted to rally his forces. He ordered his guard to form around him. Cavalry units tried to counterattack, but the battlefield was already disintegrating into isolated pockets of violence. Commands went unheard. Signals were lost in dust and noise. The Crusaders pressed relentlessly. They did not pursue strategically. They pursued emotionally. Every strike carried the weight of survival. Every fallen enemy reinforced the impossible truth unfolding before them. Saladin's army had numbers. What it lacked in that moment was certainty. As the charge carved deeper, rumors spread faster than facts. The Franks are everywhere. The center has collapsed. The Sultan is dead. None were true, but panic does not wait for confirmation. Once fear takes hold, it multiplies. Saladin's personal guard fought fiercely, buying time for their commander to regroup. But even elite troops cannot hold against a shock that shatters belief. The Crusaders' momentum fed on itself, turning a single charge into a cascading collapse. And somewhere amid the dust and blood, Saladin realized the unthinkable. He was losing control. The army he had so carefully built, the symbol of unity and inevitability, was unraveling in real time. Not because it lacked strength, but because it had been caught between movement and formation, confidence and readiness. The trap had not been terrain, it had been timing. And now, as Saladin struggled to reassert command, the battlefield began to tilt toward catastrophe. Because when an army starts to break, it does not break evenly. It fractures, suddenly, violently, and without mercy. There comes a moment in every battle when retreat stops being an option, not because it is impossible, but because choosing it would guarantee annihilation. For Baldwin IV, that moment arrived as the Crusader wedge tore into the heart of Saladin's army and began to slow. Momentum is a fragile thing. It must be fed continuously, or it dies. Baldwin understood this instinctively. He could feel the shift, not through sensation in his body, which leprosy had taken from him, but through the rhythm of the charge. The thunder of hooves was still there, but resistance was thickening. Enemy cavalry were beginning to regroup. If the Crusaders hesitated now, they would be swallowed. So Baldwin made his most dangerous decision of the day. He ordered the advance to continue. No pause, no regrouping, no consolidation of gains. The entire gamble rested on relentless pressure. They would not disengage. They would not retreat to reform. They would push forward until either Saladin's army broke completely, or they were crushed beneath it. It was the kind of decision that wins legends or erases names. The knights obeyed without question. They had already crossed the psychological line. Turning back would mean riding away from the king who had led them into the storm. Better to die moving forward than be hunted down in disorder. The Crusader force split organically into smaller groups, each fighting its own brutal micro-battle. There was no grand choreography now, only instinct, training, and fury. Knights swung swords at close quarters. Infantry stabbed at horses' legs. Templars locked shields and drove forward with terrifying discipline. Against them, Saladin's soldiers fought back with courage, but courage alone cannot restore order once it has collapsed. Units collided with one another. Commands contradicted each other. Some cavalry attempted to charge, only to find their path blocked by fleeing comrades. This was not defeat by slaughter. It was defeat by confusion. Saladin, surrounded by his guard, tried to impose order. He sent messengers galloping to rally distant units. He attempted to form a defensive line. But the battlefield had become too fluid, too fragmented. By the time orders reached their destinations, the situation had already changed. The Crusaders were everywhere and nowhere, appearing in one sector, vanishing in another, their numbers exaggerated by panic. At the center of it all, Baldwin remained visible. Accounts describe him elevated, supported, still wearing the symbols of kingship despite his condition. The image alone carried enormous weight. A king who should have been dying in bed was here, in the middle of the chaos, refusing to yield. For the Crusaders, it was electrifying. For Saladin's men, it was destabilizing. Symbols matter in war more than numbers ever will. As the battle raged, Saladin narrowly avoided capture. At one point, Crusader knights cut through so close that his standard was threatened. His bodyguards fought desperately, forming a living barrier. Several died, buying him moments to escape. The realization dawned brutally. If Saladin fell, the entire campaign would collapse instantly. And so, the priority shifted, from victory to survival. Saladin ordered a fighting withdrawal, but withdrawal requires cohesion. Many units interpreted it as flight. Others never received the order at all. The army's right flank began to disintegrate. Soldiers abandoned equipment to move faster. Horses bolted riderless across the plain. What had begun as an organized invasion was turning into a rout. The Crusaders sensed it. This was the most dangerous phase of all. An army in retreat is unpredictable. A single misstep could expose the Crusaders to encirclement or counterattack. But Baldwin refused to slow the pressure. He knew that hesitation would give Saladin time to regroup, so the order remained unchanged. Forward. The charge became pursuit. Not disciplined, not strategic, but ferocious. Knights hunted fleeing units. Infantry pressed into collapsing pockets. The battlefield stretched outward as Saladin's army scattered. In the chaos, Saladin lost much of his personal equipment. Chroniclers later noted that he escaped with only a handful of guards. His army shattered behind him. The man who had entered the kingdom as a conqueror now fled for his life. And yet, even in defeat, Saladin survived. That survival mattered. Because Montgisard was not the end of him, but it was the first time the illusion of his inevitability cracked. As the sun dipped lower, the field belonged to the Crusaders. They had done the impossible. 500 knights, supported by infantry and faith, had shattered an empire's momentum in a single afternoon. The cost was real. The losses were heavy, but the victory was undeniable. Baldwin, exhausted beyond description, was carried from the field. He had gambled everything his kingdom had left, and won. But victory carries consequences. The destruction of Saladin's army sent shockwaves across the region. Allies questioned assumptions. Enemies re-evaluated strategies. And within Jerusalem, the meaning of the miracle began to evolve. Because the question was no longer whether Baldwin could win. It was how long he could keep death at bay. By every measurable standard of medieval warfare, the charge at Montgisard should have failed. The numbers were wrong. The terrain was neutral. The enemy was experienced, well-equipped, and overwhelmingly superior. And yet, the charge not only succeeded, it shattered one of the most formidable armies of the age. To understand how, you have to step inside the minds of the men who rode that afternoon, and the men who faced them. Because Montgisard was not won by steel alone. It was won by momentum, perception, and the terrifying speed at which certainty can turn into fear. Medieval battles were rarely decided by body counts. They were decided by morale. An army that believed it was winning could endure horrific losses. An army that believed it was losing could collapse while still numerically dominant. Baldwin's charge exploited that truth perfectly. The Crusader knights were not charging because they believed victory was likely. They were charging because hesitation meant death. That psychological position is extraordinarily powerful. When retreat is removed as an option, aggression becomes absolute. There is no calculation left, only action. Every man in that formation knew the odds. That knowledge stripped away doubt. There was no illusion of survival through cleverness or caution, only through impact. Saladin's army, by contrast, believed it had already won. That belief was subtle but corrosive. Soldiers were foraging, resting, dispersing, not because they were incompetent, but because they felt safe. Safety dulls reflexes. It delays response. It encourages assumption. So when the Crusaders appeared, not hesitantly, not defensively, but charging at full speed, it created cognitive shock. This was not how defeated armies behaved. Shock in battle is contagious. The first units to see the charge hesitated. That hesitation spread outward like a ripple. Men looked to officers for orders that had not yet been given. Officers looked for formations that no longer existed. By the time clarity arrived, the Crusaders were already among them. Physics did the rest. A cavalry charge is not just men on horses. It is mass, speed, and force converging into a single moment. 500 knights, armoured, riding heavy war horses, formed a moving wall of momentum. When that wall hits an unprepared target, it does not push, it explodes through. Saladin's army was not braced for impact. Horses were scattered. Infantry was loose. Defensive lines had not formed. The Crusader wedge penetrated deep before resistance stiffened, splitting the army's centre and isolating units from one another. Once isolated, units fight blind, and blind units panic. Faith amplified everything. The presence of the true cross mattered, not because it was magically powerful, but because belief shapes behaviour. The Crusaders believed they were fighting not just for land, but for survival and salvation. That belief translated into ferocity. Men fought beyond exhaustion. Wounds were ignored. Fear was sublimated into fury. For Saladin's soldiers, the sudden reversal carried spiritual weight as well. Many believed the campaign had divine favour. The sight of a vastly outnumbered enemy breaking their ranks contradicted that belief violently. When belief fractures, cohesion follows. Another critical factor was leadership visibility. Baldwin's presence on the field, frail, suffering, unmistakable, created a moral anchor. He did not direct tactics in real time, but he did something equally important. He made retreat unthinkable. His soldiers could not abandon a king who had refused to abandon them. Saladin, conversely, was temporarily invisible. Not absent, but unseen by much of his army in the crucial early moments. Without visible command, soldiers relied on instinct, and instinct, under shock, tends towards self-preservation. That difference alone can decide battles. The Crusaders also benefited from asymmetry. They were not trying to control the battlefield. They were trying to break it. Their objective was not territory. It was collapse. Every push, every strike, every pursuit fed into that singular goal. Saladin's forces were built for campaigns, not sudden annihilation. They excelled in maneuver, endurance, and attrition. Montgisard gave them none of that. It forced them into a reactionary fight where preparation and numbers mattered less than immediacy. Even the terrain, though seemingly neutral, worked subtly in Baldwin's favour. The slight rises and uneven ground disrupted regrouping efforts. Dust clouds obscured visibility. Sound carried poorly. The battlefield became fragmented, amplifying confusion. Within hours, the damage was irreversible. An army can recover from losses. It cannot recover from a shattered sense of control in the middle of enemy territory. By the time Saladin managed to escape with his guard, the charge had already done its work. His army was not destroyed, but it was undone. Its cohesion was gone. Its confidence shattered. Montgisard became a case study in how wars are not always won by strength, but by timing, belief, and the ruthless exploitation of a single moment. Yet the story did not end on that field, because victories like this do not fade quietly. They ripple outward, into politics, into myth, into the minds of enemies who will not forget humiliation. And Saladin would not forget. An army does not collapse all at once. It unravels. At Montgisard, the breaking point did not announce itself with a single, dramatic moment. It spread quietly, unevenly, carried by dust, rumour, and fear. Long before Saladin's remaining officers could assess the damage, the defeat had already become self-sustaining. The first to flee were not cowards. They were realists. Units on the edges of the battlefield, those who felt the shock but could not see its source, made decisions in isolation. They heard shouting. They saw riders galloping past without formation. They saw standards fall. In war, these signals matter more than orders. When soldiers believe the center has collapsed, they assume the flanks are next. And so they move. Some withdrew, in good order while trying to regroup. Others fled outright. Horses overloaded with men and equipment stumbled. Supply wagons jammed narrow paths. The roads that had carried Saladin's army into Frankish territory now became corridors of panic. Crusader pursuit intensified the chaos. Baldwin had not ordered a disciplined chase. He could not afford one. His army was too small, too exhausted, too fragile. But individual units pressed forward, hunting fleeing enemies with grim determination. Every skirmish reinforced the impression of total defeat. Saladin's army fractured into fragments, each trying to survive independently. The psychological damage was immense. Many soldiers had believed they were participating in a historic campaign, the opening act of Jerusalem's fall. Now, that narrative was obliterated. Survivors struggled to understand what had happened. How could an army so large lose to one so small? There was no satisfying answer. Saladin, escorted by a dwindling guard, retreated rapidly. He abandoned equipment. He shed baggage. Chronicles record that he escaped with only a handful of men. His authority intact, but his position shaken. For a commander who had built his reputation on control and foresight, Montgisard was a wound deeper than any battlefield injury. The retreat did not end with distance. Saladin's army continued to disintegrate long after the fighting stopped. Men straggled back to friendly territory days later, alone or in small groups, carrying stories that grew darker with each telling. Some spoke of divine intervention. Others blamed fate, terrain, betrayal. What mattered was not accuracy. What mattered was memory. Within Jerusalem, the victory was received with disbelief and awe. Church bells rang, processions filled the streets. The story of the battle spread faster than any official account, shaped by fear and faith alike. 500 knights had not simply won, they had humiliated a rising empire. Baldwin IV was hailed as a miracle king, a living symbol of divine favor. His illness, once seen as a liability, now became part of the narrative. A suffering king chosen to defend the holy city against overwhelming odds. But miracles come with consequences. The nobility who had doubted Baldwin now feared him. His authority surged, but so did the expectations placed upon him. Victories create pressure, they demand repetition, and Montgisard could not be repeated. Saladin, meanwhile, did not lash out blindly. He did not seek immediate revenge. He did something far more dangerous. He learned. He tightened discipline. He restructured command. He ensured that his forces would never again be caught unprepared. Montgisard burned into his memory not as an inexplicable fluke, but as a lesson written in blood. He would not underestimate the Franks again. Nor would he underestimate Baldwin. The balance of power shifted subtly. The Crusader states gained breathing room, but not safety. Saladin's ambition remained intact, sharpened now by humiliation. The war was far from over, and Baldwin's body continued to fail. Victory had not cured him. It had only bought time. Time measured not in decades, but in fragile seasons. As celebrations faded, the reality returned. The kingdom was still small. The enemy was still powerful. And the boy king's life was still slipping away. Montgisard had delayed the inevitable, but inevitability has patience. Saladin did not speak of Montgisard as a miracle. He spoke of it as a warning. The retreat from Frankish territory was not triumphant, not orderly, and not dignified. It was survival stripped to its essentials. Saladin rode hard, changing mounts when he could, conserving neither pride nor possessions. Chroniclers would later note how close he came to capture, how his standard nearly fell, how his guard was cut down one by one, buying him moments to flee. Had he been taken, the war might have ended that afternoon. But Saladin lived, and that survival would matter far more than the victory itself. In the days that followed, Saladin did not issue grand proclamations. He did not punish commanders publicly. He did not attempt to spin the defeat into propaganda. Instead, he withdrew into calculation. The defeat had not weakened his legitimacy, but it had exposed a vulnerability he could no longer ignore. Momentum had blinded him. Montgisard taught Saladin something most rulers never learn without losing everything. Success is most dangerous when it feels inevitable. He tightened command structures immediately. Foraging was restricted. Reconnaissance expanded. Units were ordered to remain battle-ready even during deep operations. Most importantly, he resolved never again to allow his army to stretch so thin that surprise could undo him. The lesson was expensive, but invaluable. Within the Muslim world, reactions were mixed. Some allies were shaken, others were embarrassed. Critics whispered that Saladin had overreached, but Saladin's broader reputation endured. He had unified Egypt and Syria. One defeat, however shocking, did not erase that. What it did erase was complacency. Saladin reframed the conflict. Jerusalem would not fall through intimidation or raids. It would fall through patience, isolation, and inevitability. The Crusader states would be suffocated, not smashed. Baldwin IV remained a problem, but a temporary one. Saladin understood time in a way few did. He knew Baldwin's illness was terminal. He knew succession would fracture the kingdom. He did not need another Montgisard to win. He only needed to wait. Meanwhile, Baldwin's victory carried a bitter irony. Montgisard elevated him into legend, but legends are expected to endure. Baldwin could not. His health deteriorated rapidly after the battle. Riding became excruciating. Vision faded. Limbs weakened. The king who had charged an empire was being consumed by his own body, and the kingdom noticed. Internal tensions resurfaced quickly. Regents maneuvered. Succession debates intensified. Military orders gained influence as royal authority became physically constrained. Montgisard had unified the kingdom briefly, but unity born of fear rarely lasts. Saladin watched all of this closely. He did not rush another invasion. He rebuilt. He trained. He absorbed smaller territories. He allowed the Crusader states to believe Montgisard had changed the balance permanently. It had not. It had only delayed the reckoning. Yet Saladin never dismissed the battle. He remembered how quickly fortune had turned. He remembered how belief collapsed. That memory tempered his future campaigns. When he returned years later, he did so with overwhelming preparation. Montgisard haunted him, not as shame, but as discipline. For Baldwin, the escape of Saladin meant unfinished business. He had won the battle, but not the war. The enemy lived, the threat remained, and the future depended on rulers who would not have Baldwin's clarity or his willingness to gamble everything. History often turns not on victories, but on what survives them. Saladin survived Montgisard, and that survival would shape the fate of Jerusalem more than any miracle ever could. News of Montgisard travelled faster than armies ever could, carried by merchants, pilgrims, clerics, and survivors. The story crossed deserts and seas, growing larger with every retelling. In Europe, it sounded like salvation renewed. In the Islamic world, it sounded like disbelief. And in Jerusalem itself, it sounded like both a promise and a warning. Because Montgisard was not merely a battle, it was a rupture in expectation. For decades, the Crusader states had existed in a state of nervous decline. They survived, but they did not thrive. Each year felt borrowed. Each campaign by their enemies seemed closer to finality. Montgisard interrupted that narrative violently. In the courts of Europe, Baldwin IV became a symbol of divine intervention. Chroniclers wrote of angels on the battlefield, of sacred relics glowing in the sun, of a sick king chosen by God to halt the tide of Islam. The battle was preached from pulpits not as strategy, but as proof that faith still mattered. But belief, like victory, has limits. European rulers celebrated, but they did not mobilize. Montgisard did not trigger a massive new crusade. Kings were entangled in their own wars. Resources were stretched. The victory reassured them that Jerusalem could hold. For now. That hesitation would prove costly. Within the Crusader states, the aftershocks were immediate and complex. Baldwin's authority soared, but it also became more fragile. He was no longer just a king. He was a miracle, and miracles invite scrutiny. Every decision he made was weighed against Montgisard. Every failure was magnified. Political rivalries intensified. Regents and nobles maneuvered for influence over the inevitable succession. Baldwin had no heir. His sisters became political assets. Marriage alliances were negotiated not for stability, but advantage. Montgisard had bought time, but time sharpened conflict instead of resolving it. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, emerged from the battle with enhanced prestige. Their discipline had held. Their courage had been visible. As royal authority weakened physically, these orders filled the vacuum, shaping policy and defense increasingly according to their own priorities. Jerusalem became more militarized and less unified. Across the Muslim world, the reaction was quieter but more profound. Saladin's defeat did not undermine his legitimacy, but it changed expectations. Preachers adjusted their tone, scholars debated divine favor. Commanders studied the battle carefully. Montgisard became a cautionary tale. Never underestimate desperation. Rather than weakening the push against the Crusader states, the defeat refined it. Saladin's vision hardened. Jerusalem would not be reclaimed through spectacle or overconfidence. It would be reclaimed through discipline, unity, and patience. One miracle would not outweigh years of preparation. The long war resumed, but with sharper edges. Baldwin continued to rule for nearly a decade after Montgisard, though his condition worsened relentlessly. He could no longer ride into battle. He could barely appear in public. Regents ruled in his name, and the kingdom fractured beneath the weight of competing ambitions. When Baldwin finally died in 1185, the kingdom lost more than a king. It lost coherence. Within 2 years, Saladin returned, not as a raider, not as a gambler, but as an executioner of strategy. At Hattin, the Crusader army would be destroyed. Jerusalem would fall. The miracle of Montgisard would feel like a distant memory. And yet, Montgisard would still matter, because it proved something fundamental about history. Empires are not invincible. Numbers are not destiny. And sometimes, a single day, driven by courage, desperation, and timing, can bend the arc of history, even if only briefly. That day did not save Jerusalem forever, but it ensured that its fall would not come easily. History remembers victories in 2 ways. First as events, then as meaning. Montgisard did not survive because of its military consequences alone. It survived because people needed it to mean something, and over time, that meaning grew larger than the battlefield itself. In the years after Baldwin IV's death, the story of Montgisard began to change. What had once been a desperate gamble became, in retelling, a moment of divine intervention. Chroniclers emphasized the true cross. They described heavenly signs. They framed the battle as proof that God still watched over Jerusalem, even as the kingdom fractured from within. This was not deception. It was human instinct. When people face loss, of land, of leaders, of certainty, they cling to moments that reassure them that their suffering once mattered. Montgisard became that reassurance. A memory of defiance in a world moving inexorably toward defeat. Baldwin himself became legend. The sick king transformed into a martyr figure, pure, tragic, chosen. His leprosy, once a political liability, was reinterpreted as spiritual symbolism. He suffered so that the kingdom might live. He endured decay while holding back darkness. Reality, of course, was more complicated. Baldwin was not a saint on horseback. He was a calculating ruler who understood risk, psychology, and timing. Montgisard was not won by miracle alone. It was won by exploiting human error and battlefield dynamics. But legends are not built on nuance. They are built on resonance. For Saladin, Montgisard occupied a different place in memory. Muslim chroniclers did not erase the defeat, but they contextualized it. It became a lesson, a moment of humility before greater triumphs. When Jerusalem fell in 1187, Montgisard was reframed as a temporary setback in a righteous struggle that ultimately succeeded. And in that sense, both sides claimed the battle. One as proof of divine favor, the other as proof of perseverance. Modern historians see Montgisard differently still. They see it as a reminder that history is shaped not just by systems, but by moments of extreme imbalance, when one side has nothing left to lose and the other assumes it has already won. They see it as a study in shock warfare, morale collapse, and leadership psychology. They see it as fragile. Because Montgisard could not be repeated, it required a precise alignment of factors: a dying king unafraid of risk, an overconfident enemy, perfect timing, and a willingness to commit fully without retreat. Remove any one of those elements, and the miracle vanishes. That is why it remains so compelling. It is not comforting. It is unsettling. It tells us that empires can falter in moments of arrogance, that underdogs can reshape history, but only briefly, that courage can bend time, but not stop it. Montgisard did not save Jerusalem, but it gave the kingdom one final, defiant chapter written in fire and steel, and it gave history one of its most haunting reminders. Sometimes 500 nights are enough, not to change the world forever, but to remind it that nothing is inevitable.